Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. I said good morning, but good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. That's one of the great things about Zoom and this new world we're living in. Delighted to welcome you to this program on G20 fiscal responses to the Covid19 crisis. We have an excellent panel who have graciously volunteered their time to talk about this timely issue. I want to also thank the Embassy of Japan for their support for this event and making it possible. Before I introduce our panel, I'll make some brief framing remarks, and then we will run for about, we'll run exactly 1 hour. We'll finish at 9:30 a.m. Washington time. The last 15 minutes or so, I will take questions from the audience. So if you are watching online and you'd like to ask questions, please do so through the our event page at CSIS. There should be a link there that you can use to ask questions. As I say, we'll end sharply at 9:30. So governments have unleashed massive spending to offset the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, the largest global shock since the Great Depression. The economics program at CSIS has been following this story very closely. Through June, the IMF estimated that announced fiscal measures amounted to about 11 trillion, that's trillion with a T, US dollars, with about half in direct spending and foregone revenue, and the other half in liquidity support. The group of 20 advanced economies, advanced and developing emerging economies, have accounted for the bulk of this spending. I'm sorry, I do mean the advanced countries within the G20 have spent about 11% of their collective GDP. Direct G20 support has amounted to over 6% in just a few months, compared to about 4.3% in response to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So this has been really extraordinary fiscal support. You still have the IMF, the Fed, and others calling for more spending. So that's something that we want to talk about as well. Today, we're mainly going to focus on fiscal support, but obviously monetary policy has also been important and complementary, and we may touch on that as well as the market implications of all of this. So we have a lot to cover. We hope that by the end, this will give policymakers in all three of the capitals that are represented here on this call and elsewhere some new material to learn from the successes of different country approaches, and to look at gaps and as they develop new support mechanisms. So you know, we're especially, it's timely to do this week because, as most of this audience knows, the IMF and World Bank will be having their annual meetings here in Washington, or actually virtually in Washington, as it were, over the next week. So we think this is a very timely conversation. So with that, we're lucky to have an excellent panel today to help us cover this ground. We're representing 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world: Japan, Germany, and the United States. So let me introduce in alphabetical order our 3 panelists. First, Joyce Chang is chair of global research at JP Morgan's Corporate and Investment Bank. Her team studies all sectors in which the firm does business, including equities, currencies, emerging markets, global macroeconomics. She serves on a number of boards, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Economic Club of New York, and many other organizations. So we're delighted to have Joyce with us. Next is Dr. Holger Fabich, who is Deputy Director General for Multilateral Cooperation and International Climate Finance at the German Federal Ministry of Finance. He has had a number of positions at the finance ministry, including working especially on G7, G8, G20 issues, as well as currency issues and others. In fact, he was coordinator for the G7 presidency of Germany in 2014-15. And the G20 presidency in 2017. So he's a real expert, a fellow traveler. I'm also a G7, G20 Sherpa or Yak deputy Sherpa. So good to have you with us, Holger. And then Ichiro Oishi, last but not least, is Minister of Finance at the Embassy of Japan here in Washington. Oishi-san has over 30 years of professional experience in public and multilateral institutions since he started his career at the Ministry of Finance in Japan in 1989. He's again held many important positions in international finance, international tax policy, multilateral development banks, and other issues. So I'm delighted to have Oishi-san with us as well. So we're going to begin with Oishi-san, who has a brief presentation. So Oishi-san, if you want to load or share your slides, we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Ichiro Oishi, Minister of Finance at the Embassy of Japan in the United States. I'm originally from the Ministry of Finance, and I'm pleased to participate in today's discussion. Without further ado, let me jump into my presentation. I'm going to use slides for my presentation. This is the first slide. First slide shows the number of new COVID-19 cases and deaths in Japan, the US, and some European countries on a per million people basis. As you can clearly see, the number in Japan shown by the gray line has been much lower than that of the Europe or the US, both in terms of the cases and deaths. I will not go into too much detail on potential reasons behind this striking difference, since there is no confirmed evidence or analysis yet. But some health experts speculate that the combination of Japan's hygienic culture, such as washing hands regularly or wearing masks always, and its healthcare infrastructure, including universal healthcare options and local medical offices, have contributed to the situation in Japan so far. Oops. Although the case and death counts in Japan have been comparably lower than the negative economic impact of COVID-19 on Japan has still been as severe as those in other countries. The next slide shows Japan's quarterly GDP growth and the future outlook, which is consensus forecast of major Japanese economists. When you see the left-hand side graph, it may appear to signal a V-shaped recovery, but please look at the right-hand side graph. Rather than the growth rate, more important is the level of GDP, which is remain under pre-COVID levels through the end of 2021. In other words, even with Japan's relative small number of COVID cases, many economists in Japan expect a Nike-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped one. The next slide shows the distinct difference in the labor market between Japan and the US. The unemployment rate in Japan has not risen as much as that in the US. To some extent, this could be explained by the difference of practice in labor markets. In Japan, as you may know, the labor market is relatively stable or inflexible. That is, in Japan, labor contracts are generally considered to last longer than those in the US. Therefore, it is the last resort for Japanese private companies to lay off their employees, even in a severe economic downturns. This difference in employment practice is naturally reflected in different fiscal responses in Japan and the US. After looking at the COVID-19 situation and macroeconomic situation briefly, I'd like to explain the fiscal responses to COVID-19 by the Japanese government. This slide summarizes those responsive measures. The Japanese government decided two supplementary budgets in April and May. The combined size is $2.2 trillion, or over 40% of Japan's GDP. This large amount is, of course, unprecedented. Although it is difficult to internationally compare size of fiscal expenditure to tackle COVID-19, it would be safe to say that this number is one of the largest in the world. It is worth noting that this number includes not only $1.2 trillion of direct fiscal expenditure, but also over $1 trillion in other support, such as liquidity assistance by providing non-interest loans or allowing tax deferral. In usual cases, people tend to focus more on the size of direct fiscal expenditure rather than the total size of economic measures, because they believe what impacted the economy most is actual direct spending by the government. However, due to the unique nature of this COVID-19 crisis, that is the sudden disappearance of demand, liquidity assistance to support severely affected industries is as important as direct fiscal expenditure. Japan's economic package consists of two phases. The first phase is emergency support. Among other measures, the first and most important was developing preventive measures to save people's lives. As we remember, there was lack of supply in masks and disinfectants at the beginning of the pandemic. Therefore, it was important for the government to secure such a supply. Secondly, the government provided fiscal support to protect employment. Unlike other countries, mandatory shutdown of business has never been legislated in Japan. However, demand in certain industries disappeared as much as in other countries because people followed the government's recommendations, such as staying home, teleworking, reducing the number of people in office, shortening the business hours, and so on. In order to avoid sudden mass unemployment, the government subsidized firms that maintain employment. Additionally, the government committed to huge liquidity expansion through government-owned banks. In the US, I think the FRB created various facilities to support liquidity for not only financial institutions, but also non-financial institutions. In Japan, the government utilized existing government-owned banks to provide such support to Main Street industries. Last but not least, the government provided approximately $1,000 cash transfer to all residents in Japan. The second phase of the fiscal package targets recovery phase of the economy. This is unique, actually, in Japan to include recovery phase measures in the early policy responses to COVID-19. I think this has benefited the Japanese business community by providing predictability to future support. First, the government provided support for affected industries, including tourism, restaurants, event organizers, and so on. The support ranges widely in its applications. One example is that when people domestically travel in Japan, they can get direct support for up to 50% of their travel expense. Second, the government has also included measures to develop resilient economic structure based on this emergency experience, such as subsidy to companies that reshore or diversify their supply chain so that they can avoid depending on one specific region or country for their production processes. Going forward, no one knows for sure when things will return to normal, but we policymakers must achieve a balance between containing the virus and sustaining economic growth by implementing whatever it takes, which is not so easy, of course. I hope my presentation today sheds some light on Japan's experience. I look forward to further discussion. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oishi-san. That was excellent and very clear, and leads to a number of follow-up questions, which I will come to after we allow our other speakers to give their first initial thoughts. And so, if I can, let me turn to Holga and ask you, frankly, Germany has done a lot, and a little bit more than I think most people expect when you think about German usually being so prudent about fiscal spending. But in fact, Germany has really spent a lot in this crisis. Can you sort of explain that and how those choices were made, and what's worked better than other things?
Yes. Please. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Matthew, for this, also for your kind introduction. Yes, indeed. The question is, how come that Germany, out of the blue, more or less, is becoming, a country that so heavily engages in fiscal policy? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, we have always said, and in fact, that is also as true as the black zero, as our balanced budget, that we've always said we don't do this, just for the sake of being fiscally prudent, but we do this in order to have our powder dry if something bad happens. And we had to realize in early March or late February this year that indeed something really bad had happened, and that we are located in the center of Europe, and that people come from every parts of the world into our country, and that we have a corona problem. And then we acted quite decisively. What clearly helped also was that we had to acknowledge that monetary policy is at the zero lower bound. There was not much that could be done from that end, and hence every economist would know there is nothing left but fiscal policy. And so we didn't really had to think long, and then we acted very decisively. Oishi-san has just shown a slide where he had this staggering number of 42.2% of GDP as a fiscal stimulus. Ours is not that large. It is to the tune of 15% of GDP, 1.5. But it does have significant numbers. We, of course, started out like everybody else with liquidity support to our companies, especially the small ones, eventually brought in also support measures for larger companies. We also have had a major fiscal package that was already a little later in the game, after the immediate crisis measures had been enacted, and there we are particularly proud that we have what we call the 4 T's. The classic fiscal stimulus package should have 3 T's. It should be targeted, timely, and temporary. We also have a 4th T, which is transformative, because we are very, very serious. My minister is, the whole of government is very serious in building back better. We want to use this opportunity to really get this transformation into a greener, more sustainable way of doing business, which is why a large chunk of this stimulus package is actually about transformation. And this is not a contradiction. Of course, jobs will be lost maybe in some segments of the economies, but we do hope that they will be rebuilt and in larger numbers in other parts of the economy. So that is in a nutshell what we did, as I said, to the tune of 15% of GDP. We also, being, as I said, located in the center of Europe, we also from the very beginning saw that we also have to do something at the European level. And here, policymakers in Germany like to talk about the Hamiltonian moment, referring to the former finance minister or secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Hamilton, who under his watch, as you know better than I do, fiscal integration in the United States really had a big push forward. And so we have this major stimulus package also at the European level of 750 billion euros. As you all know, we are working very hard as we speak to get this really on the street, quite literally. And there is, of course, a lot to be discussed still and a lot to be decided. But we are absolutely determined to bring this to fruition towards the end of this year and get it started at the beginning of the next year. I have never seen so much pragmatism and so much willingness to compromise at the European level as right now. Everybody knows the situation is completely very, very serious, and we have to set aside traditional ways of thinking and fighting and as we do our European approach. Finally, before I turn it back to you, Matthew, on the international level, here too, I think we had, I must say, a really efficient G20 presidency by Saudi Arabia, who quickly realized we can only do this by video conferencing, but who did this very efficiently. And so we had productive meetings starting in March, but then of course the finance ministers meeting in April, where we have endorsed the ACTA accelerator, the Exit to COVID Tools accelerator. We have now added later in the game in July, the COVAX facility. We have the debt suspension initiative, debt service suspension initiative for now. We have made sure that there is a much bigger net flow from multilateral development banks to emerging markets, to low-income countries, because that is very much needed now. We have put more money into the catastrophe containment and relief trust of the IMF, and to the WHO, of course. I think this is obviously a pandemic, so it makes no sense at all to only look into your own economy. This is a job that humanity as a whole has to tackle, and we have to work together. And we figured that this is extremely important from the very beginning. So I always just to conclude, I think we are right in the middle of it. Everybody who thinks this will be over in the next couple of weeks, I think, is seriously out of touch with reality, and fighting the consequences. And you know, here comes a German comment: consolidating our budgets eventually will last years, if not decades. So we in Germany right now, as in many other parts of the world, the numbers, the infection numbers go up again, because we have, you know, come back from lockdown and have allowed people to travel. So we are in the middle of what epidemiologists call the dance. You know, we are dancing on this razor's edge between restrictions and you know, letting the economy go, and this will last at least for another year. That's at least my hunch on it, and I'm very excited to be part of it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Holger. Really terrific. And again, clear presentation of the German response and sort of how you see this as so different and important for you know, the government to take a position that is not sort of conventional, or you explained the conventional aspect by talking about the powder being dry and keeping the powder dry for exactly a situation like this. I'm also glad you introduced the international dimension, which I'm going to follow up on, because that is a very important part of this. So thank you. Let Joyce come in. Joyce, the US response has been much in the news, including overnight, where we had 24 hours ago, the president saying he was suspending the White House negotiations with Congress about a new fiscal package, but then he tweeted overnight that actually he wants at least one part of the fiscal package, basically cash payments to individuals, to be put in front of him so he can sign that immediately. So there's still a lot of debate. It's very fluid, but talk to us about the US response and how effective it's been, and in comparison to other countries as well.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you and Holger and Oishi-san. So let me just start by talking about the developments overnight and how that's changed our forecast. So we have phased out phase 4 of the fiscal stimulus package, and we actually think that has a very meaningful impact on household spending and on quarterly growth. We think this means about a 12% reduction in household spending in the fourth quarter of the year, and we've taken 1 full percentage point, going from 3.5% to 2.5%, still above trend for fourth quarter growth. And we've taken down our first quarter 2021 growth by about 0.5 percentage point to 2%. Now, we had already made these changes even before the announcements. You saw that it was very hard even to get, you know, the skinny bill that was only $500 billion to get Senate Republicans in to vote for that. And now they're focused on the Supreme Court. But this does have material implications for the fiscal outlook. And I think you will see some piecemeal measures, but for for the phase 4 package, the assumptions had been that it would be at least $1 trillion, maybe $1.5 trillion. So it is a meaningful hit. So let me just step back a moment now and just talk about the kind of global recovery we're in, because I've seen every letter of the alphabet used for this, and we are looking at a financial markets recovery that has been V-shaped, and some aspects of the recovery that have been V-shaped. But if I were to leave you with just one word to characterize this recovery, and following up on what Helga said, it's incomplete. Incomplete is the word to remember. So we've had a very sharp and strong rebound of global growth in the third quarter in the financial markets that's V-shaped, but that's not enough to deliver a complete recovery, even by the end of 2021. We estimate that global GDP will be about 4 percentage points below its pre-pandemic level at the end of 2021. And that implies lower potential growth for the next decade. This is also a worse hit than the global financial crisis. Now, you've talked about the size of the fiscal package, but I just want to go through what has happened with central bank balance sheets. So we've seen a $6 trillion expansion in just 6 months of central bank balance sheets, and we think it's going to be $8 trillion for the year, half of that coming from the Fed. That's a 17 percentage point rise in G4 central bank balance sheets, or triple the level of what we saw during the global financial crisis, because we have hit the lower bound. So we've been left with fiscal policy and central bank balance sheet expansion. The Fed has stepped in at an unprecedented pace. They've purchased 8% of GDP and 11% of the share of public debt that's outstanding. So this is completely without precedent. Globally, we're looking at fiscal deficits this year that will be around 14% of GDP, with the US running the highest fiscal deficit, 16% of GDP in more than 80 years. And we're looking at the impact on sovereign debt levels, bringing this to a 70-year high. We are looking at increases in sovereign debt levels that are double digits, as much as 20% in some countries. So what does this mean? What are the policy implications? What are the long-term implications? Well, there now is a much more expansive political debate on whether the central bank's key mandate has gravitated to ensuring easy financial conditions, promoting financial stability, and ensuring treasury market function rather than traditional monetary policy. None of these measures have yet to bring back inflation. So I think that if you take a look at this, how much further can it go? It can go quite a bit further in our view. Central banks are close to the effective lower bound on policy rates, but as far as central bank balance sheets and fiscal policy, they're a long way from their limits. So if we take a look at the US government, for example, the Fed purchases of US treasuries are 95% below the peak that they reached in the spring at the height of the crisis. If we take a look at the Fed purchases in the corporate bond market, this has been very minimal, but the capital markets have been open. So this year, we think that U.S. high-grade corporate bonds, there will be 1.75 trillion of issuance, an all-time record. The Fed purchases have been, in the order of, less than $15 billion. So central banks still have enormous room to use their balance sheets to hold down borrowing costs, ensure liquidity provision, support financial markets, and create a favorable funding environment for fiscal authorities. But will this bring back growth? And will it bring inflation back to target? And have we moved beyond the traditional mandate? So there are questions that remain. Will central banks commit to using even more new tools? We do see additional QE, the pandemic emergency program, these measures being extended for the time being. But we've also seen that with respect to growth, the baton really has turned to fiscal support. And that raises medium-term concerns on monetary policy independence and fiscal dominance. And we have the rising debt levels that we'll be stuck with. We expect that global government net issuance this year will soar by about $8.5 trillion this year, and another $6.5 trillion next year. Just net treasury issuance alone in the US is an additional $5.5 trillion this year. And we're seeing the impact of this on the corporate sector. Gross leverage for US high-grade corporates has reached 3.7 times. So, what does this all mean at the end of the day as we look at the deficits going forward? We look at the US election cycle. So just taking a look at the Democratic Party platform and the proposals, the Penn-Wharton budget model recently reviewed Biden's proposals. They think that he would raise an additional $3.375 trillion in revenue due to higher income taxes, corporate taxes, payroll taxes. But his proposals also would mean another $5.35 trillion in expenditures, the infrastructure program for $2 trillion, education, research and development. So beyond these record deficits we've already talked about, we're looking at another $2 trillion over the next decade if we were to see a Democratic platform put into place as it's been proposed. So, as Holga and as Oishi said, that this is without precedent. These are problems that are here to stay and will endure, but the more enduring effects really could be what this means for potential growth and the kind of recovery we have in store, just given the size of the fiscal and the debt burdens.
Okay, that's terrific and quite sobering as well. So I'm taking away from all of this, this is a huge shock. It's not over. It's required a huge response, and that's not over. There needs to be more support, fiscal and monetary. So that all leads to a question for all of you, which is about the debt. You've touched on it here, Joyce, but others I'm interested in as well. I mean, Japan and the US in particular started with a pretty serious debt challenge, and this is going to add to that. It's going to add to Germany's debt as well, and other countries in Europe. And the question is, how do you manage that as a long-term matter against this short-term need? And as you manage it and try to move back towards consolidation, as Holga started to hint at, how do you maintain the social spending and the other support to deal with the long-term sort of scarring that is going to result from this crisis? It's in any particular order, but maybe Oishi-san, because Japan has had the biggest starting point of high debt. How are you going to deal with all this extra debt?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. But of course, that's very interesting but difficult question to answer. Of course, as many people you mentioned that the general consensus at this moment is that debt should not be our priority concern. Of course, that is the biggest economic shock in the century or in the history, and one that needs government intervention. And under this situation, it has been the right choice for the government to commit to whatever it takes policy thus far. Of course, that it is important to spend money, to make sure that the government spend money in smartly and targeted purposes to encourage a resilient economy rather than spreading themselves too thinly. But at some point, people need to revisit structural deficit, especially in the case of Japan. Although the fiscal stimulus in response to COVID-19 is once in a lifetime expenditure, there has been a huge gap revenue and expenditure in Japan, even under normal circumstances. And this structural gap is expected to widen due to the natural increase of social security expenditure caused by aging society. And I think the government still, of course, has a medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, which is to achieve the fiscal primary balance surplus in the year of 2025. Of course, that it's not very easy, but I think as a fiscal authority, we have to remind the people of the structural problem and to tackle this debt burden issues at some point. But of course, this is not the timing at this moment. And that's what I can say. Thank you.
Okay, that's helpful. and I want to follow up on that, but let me ask Holga and then Joyce to also weigh in on this question of balancing, managing debt with continuing to provide, the support needed for the economy going forward.
Yes. Well, I think my first point would be that it's really important that we not withdraw fiscal stimulus too early now. I have alluded to the dance that epidemiologists always refer to, and we are on this dance. And so it would be a huge mistake now to go ahead and start consolidating right away. As Joyce was saying, this is incomplete at a minimum. And so as long as the recovery is not complete, there is no point in starting consolidation. Of course, debt levels are worrying, but interest rates are very low. This is a huge help, in fact. If you look at the German consolidation of the past 8 years, it actually wasn't really a consolidation. It was really saving interest payments. And as long as this lasts, we are in a relatively comfortable position across the world, in fact. When interest rates start to rise, that, of course, will change the game, but this is not foreseeable at least not for now. I would assume, like Joyce, like Oishi, that governments will, central banks will continue accommodating for the foreseeable future. By the way, the balance sheet of the ECB is now safely above 40% of Eurozone GDP. So we are even in, as far as QE is concerned, we are even in yet another territory. What I wanted to stress also is that under this EU program that I mentioned, the 750 billion program, we do have grants, in fact, for those European countries that already are heavily indebted and who have to pay higher interest rates on their national debt. So we factored this in from the very beginning, that we have to be mindful of debt levels and give grants to those that are in need. Yet another issue is, of course, the situation in emerging markets and low-income countries. Here, with markets, with their primary markets in the rich world, not in incomplete recovery, to quote Joyce again, there are foreseeable problems, and which is why we have the DSSI. And as you mentioned, Matthew, the annual meetings, I am quite sure that we will see a continuation of this exercise, even something beyond. We have to tackle this problem. That is very clear. So that would be my one last thing, because this is the CSIS. Germany will for sure not reduce military spending. We have vowed this to our NATO partners, and that is safe from consolidation. We are rather going to increase it in line with NATO targets, regardless who will win the election in 4 weeks' time. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure that will reassure some of our audience. Joyce, what about your perspective, or can you elaborate on what you've already said about the debt concern?
Well, I think the big thing to focus on is the debt servicing cost. And here is why we are really low for long and here to stay. So you had that bond yields had already been falling across the world for 40 years, even before the pandemic. But now, if we take a look at developed market government bonds, so safe haven assets, we estimate that 80% of them, or $34 trillion, have a yield that is 50 basis points or less. So 15 trillion of that is a negative yield, but then you have that basically close to zero yield, 80% of the developed market countries. So they're going to have to continue to keep rates low for a long time, given what the debt service burden is. And that does have implications for investors, because probably the most successful thing so far about these packages has been that the financial markets have recovered. And so we've really written that, this is sort of the credit crisis that wasn't, but the returns crisis that looms. For the last 45 years, if you did a traditional asset allocation formula, like 60% equities, 40% fixed income, you could earn about a 10% return. We think going forward, given where bond yields are at, that you're probably looking at something that's 1/3 that amount, like a 3.5% return, if you stick with that formula. So we see that a search for yield is on in the financial markets, just given where bond yields are at. And for everything that we have talked about in this session, that there is just enormous enormous forces that will keep bond yields low for long, given the level of the debt burden that has been incurred. So there is the impact that this is going to have on financial markets, and then there's the impact on growth from having this type of fiscal and debt overhang. Now, after the 2008 global financial crisis, we took about 0.4% off of potential growth off of our global GDP forecast. What will this mean as far as where potential growth ends up, given that this is a higher cost crisis than the 2008 global financial crisis? So we are still working through some of these numbers, but we've looked at China as an example, where China is the one country that is growing positively, where we've had to take the growth forecasts up actually since our initial estimates, and we think we take about 0.4 off of China's growth off of the next decade. So there are the growth implications. There's also the debt servicing costs and the ramifications of needing to keep interest rates low for a very long time.
Okay, gosh, there's so much to follow up on, and we don't have enough time. But let me ask more about sort of some specific approaches that may be interesting and informative to other countries. So let me go to you, Holger, and ask about two things. One, you have this program of Kurzarbeit, if I'm getting that correct, which is basically support for wages for currently employed people who may be at risk of being laid off, and so it's to support their incomes, and keep them in work. Supporting 60, 70, 80% in some countries in Europe, this is being done. Japan and the US have taken somewhat different approaches of giving direct cash payments to people, or to beefing up unemployment system. So I'm interested in the German experience with that approach, and whether that's been a positive thing. And then I want later for Oishi-san and Joyce to talk about sort of the different approaches in their countries. And then Holger, different question, but about how this money is targeted. You said before that that your spending is 4 T's: targeted, timely, temporary, and transformative. On the transformative, you talked about sustainable and green investment. The IMF just, I think yesterday or the day before, put out a fiscal monitor piece in which they advocated that countries spend more fiscally public investment, but they emphasized maintaining existing infrastructure, roads and bridges and so forth. And because that you can get the money in quickly and employ a lot of people. Whereas things like green infrastructure or digital infrastructure are good things in principle, and you should start planning for those, but they're sort of longer term and they take a longer time and don't have the same immediate impact, if I'm not distorting exactly what the IMF said. I think in essence, that's what the point was. So I'm just challenging you on that kind of investment. Does that make sense in the middle of a crisis, or is that sort of a longer term thing that we should all be looking at? A lot in there, sorry.
Yeah, sure, no, that's fine. Maybe briefly on the Kurzarbeit, you pronounced this correctly. I salute you for your German. So the short, for those who don't know German, the short-term work scheme. This actually was something that we used in the great financial crisis already, which we are using now again, but we have expanded it. The most important thing to know about this is that people stay on the payroll of the respective company. They just go home basically and wait until a new contract rolls in, at which time the employer can call them back to work at any moment basically. But they stay on the workforce, and if they get trained, there are special subsidies that the government pays to them. We have expanded this. It's even more generous than it used to be, and that really stabilizes our labor market right now, and also of course domestic demand, consumption, because these people are not unemployed and the rates are much more generous than the unemployment insurance. So we want to keep this. We have just expanded it, and let's see how long we are going to need it. On the transformative, well, first off, we have already had quite a sizable investment plan, traditional investment plan in our budget before COVID hit. So this is not something we had to do in addition. What comes on in addition now is really that we are trying to trigger more investment into renewables, into hydrogen, for example, and that we are trying to invest more in our grids, and that we are trying to make our whole energy system more sustainable. And that is something that I where we. If you think of the in a Keynesian world, you want to do a fiscal boost. You have, of course, several options, and you can of course start building additional roads, which I think in Germany we don't need that much. We have to make sure the old roads are good, and then we have to maintain them. But rather than building yet another road and yet another airport, we decided to build some hydrogen parks, for example, and that is, of course, that caters to a very special subset of the workforce, but still, it may trigger, we hope, a revolution in the way we do our energy supply. Last point on my side, we of course inherited also another crisis pre-COVID, which is the auto sector crisis in Germany. That of course was already in full swing before COVID hit us. It's a huge transformation from the combustion engine to new ways of running cars, and that is interfering in a very sophisticated way with the situation we have now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good, helpful. So Oishi-san and Joyce, thoughts on those two dimensions of the response and how Japan or the US has thought about those kinds of things? Oishi-san?
Yeah. In the case of Japan, that as I mentioned in my presentation, that Japan's initial response is in a sense unique in that it included the recovery phase measures. And that is like measures to support the tourism or restaurant industries and so on. But I think it's recovery phase measures in the short term, but still I think short-term measures. So, but I think Japan or the government is also trying to is also include some measures like supporting the recovery of society as it exists now. And also I think as Holger-san mentioned, that I think Japan is also implementing or including fiscal measures to tackle transitional support. One example is that enhancement of supply chain via reshoring or diversifying. Another example is digitalization, which is one of the priorities of the new Suga Prime Minister administration, allowing workers to continue their work in a flexible manner or encouraging online medical service and education. I think those two transitional measures are included and started already in the land from the point of view longer term.
I did want to ask about both that reshoring fund and about the digitization plan, but I think we're going to have to do a separate event because those are interesting responses as well. But we'll do that another time. Joyce, and if you could be brief, because I do want to try to get a couple of audience questions in, and I still have one more quick question myself. Go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, so we've really had to work through scenarios based on the US elections of status quo, a blue wave, or whether you could have a Biden victory with a split Congress. And so that has real implications for what will happen with tax policy. So we are still looking at an unemployment rate for the US that we think at the end of 2021 will be around 7%. So, as Oishi and Holga said, the unemployment problem was not as big in Europe and Japan, given the kinds of packages that were put into place and the subsidies that were put into place. But I think the key thing is, will you see, tax increases or a rollback in some of the tax cuts, to raise the revenue? If you take a look at the Biden proposal, it has a lot of aspects of it that are also aimed to be transformative. A green recovery as part of the $2 trillion infrastructure spending package. And there are specific targets as well to lend to small businesses, and target underserved communities to create 1 million jobs in the auto sectors as well. But for the US, we really kind of looked at 3 different scenarios based on what the election outcome is for how the direction of policy will play out in 2021.
Excellent. Okay, let me transition into the audience questions through the question that I was going to ask, because a lot of the questions so far have been about the G20 and the international response and issues. So there's a question about, hasn't the G20 been, ineffective in response given how serious the problem is in many emerging markets? Currency challenges, volatility, fiscal constraints, high unemployment. There are a lot of real challenges in emerging markets, and the G20 by comparison seems to have done relatively less. It's done some things, which Holger mentioned, but not as much as it did in the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So there are a bunch of questions around that question of international response and cooperation. But first, before I ask Holger and others to elaborate, Joyce, how bad is it in emerging markets, and how worried should we be about the conditions in some of these other G20 countries and beyond?
So first of all, I would say that emerging markets is not a monolith. There's really 3 categories of emerging markets. There's North Asia, which is doing pretty well, and China, and they are net creditors, and they're actually some of the biggest creditors now to the poorest emerging markets countries. Then there's the middle income, larger emerging markets, your Brazils, Mexico's, South Africa's, Turkey's, and many of these countries were either on the cusp of investment grade or just lost their investment grade rating. And there's a real question on whether this could be a lost decade, that really, we're talking about an incomplete recovery, but is it 5 years for emerging markets, 10 years for emerging markets, a lost decade? And then you've got the very poorest low income emerging markets country, where we're talking much more about debt relief. And so I think it's hard to put it all in one monolith, but I think what we've seen for emerging markets is that the amount of resources that can be marshaled has been relatively modest. All developed market central banks have had to really worry about their own populations first. And so I just think there's a very careful balance that needs to be struck here, because you've actually have that market access for those countries, particularly the middle income ones, remains very important. It's more important in many ways than what official creditors are going to be able to marshal for them in this kind of environment where everybody is putting their own population first. And I think you also have to engage China, because China now is a net creditor. Whether it was through Belt and Road or other initiatives, there were many ways in which some of the support that China was expected to provide could also be pulled back. So I think in emerging markets, we are looking at, for example, in Latin America, a more than 8% contraction in Latin America this year, after 6 years of not achieving potential growth. You have countries like South Africa that are running fiscal deficits that are 16% of GDP, and they can't print money. It's not like the United States, where the reserve currency. Turkey, where we've had pressures on the foreign exchange markets as well. So this is a period for emerging markets where it's a much more serious challenge, because you're still not out of the woods on COVID-19, where they've been able to stabilize the situation. Putting in the social distancing, the size of the informal economies has made this just very challenging for the emerging markets countries. And, we are looking at the huge divergence within emerging markets. Like China, for example, we do think will grow 2.5% this year. That actually does look very V-shaped, but that's not the case for, the regions outside of the North Asia region.
So Holger, given that story, I mean, it sounds like, it's a pretty serious situation. It's especially for the lower income countries. And the G20 has done the debt service suspension initiative, but that's not debt relief. And it's temporary, even though you hinted that it might be extended next week, which I agree with is likely to happen. But, is that enough? What more should the international community be doing here?
Yes, well, that's a very pertinent question, and I listened attentively to what Joyce said just a moment ago, and it's absolutely true. I mean, you said I hinted to that. I don't want to, as a good government official, I cannot, tell you more at this stage. But as everybody can gather, there are discussions going on how to, extend this, how to possibly enlarge this. The problem is very clear. And we all know, even in industrialized countries, that we have a huge debt burden to carry, and that the weaker your economy is, the more cumbersome, the more dangerous that might be. And so, brace for impact, or stay tuned to what will happen next week and after. And as far as the effectiveness of the G20 reaction is concerned, I have to say, and I am doing this G20 business now for 10 years, it is a very difficult situation for international cooperation for the reasons we all know. We could imagine much more. And if I think about the WTO, if I think about the WHO, if I think about many other things that need a strong, if I think about the Paris Agreement, there are so many things where indeed international cooperation, be it through the G20, the G7, or whatever, is needed. I can only hope that this will
at the need for U.S. involvement and even leadership in those institutions and those efforts as part of the story. And you're probably also hinting at the differences between some of the major players in the G20, especially U.S. and China. And
exactly. And as long as we can't resolve this, or come to a situation where real negotiations can take place, it'll be very difficult, the truth be told. But I am optimistic. I think this will work out eventually. Like you all are in international affairs. We all know these things tend to work out eventually. The question is, will we come too late? I hope not.
Okay. Oishi-san, do you have any thoughts about that international story? And Japan has been, I mean, it's the biggest contributor to the IMF and to other international efforts. Its view is very important. How do you see all of that?
Yeah, of course that I'm also looking forward that next week's G20 or IMF World Bank meeting will result in some, to some extent, some sort of consensus regarding the SSI. I think, of course, the IMF has been very active in providing loans or programs, PRGT or SSL or other very useful credit facilities very quickly. That is also very encouraging. And regarding having said that, of course, the implementation of the SSI is a very important thing, and especially that we have to make sure that all the creditors, including China, of course, equally contribute to this liquidity needs in the SSI, in DSS initiative. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, much more to talk about there, and we're going to have to do further work on this. We do track the G20, and we're thinking about doing something around the Saudi summit next month. But stay tuned for that. Can I just ask a final question, really, from the audience, which we have literally 1 minute, but there's a question about, will fiscal stimulus and low interest rates lead to many nations having problems with low GDP growth, low inflation, and high deficits similar to the Japanese economy? So I think we've touched on all of this, but are we really in for, by the way, Japan, despite all those problems, is actually a very nice place and has a lot of strengths. And so I don't mean to imply, and I don't think the questioner was, that Japan is somehow not a successful economy, but are we in a kind of a long-term, is this really different from other crises we've had in the past, where there could really be some deeper, longer-term implications, especially for advanced economies? Joyce, I don't know whether you want to take that on.
Yeah, no, I do think that one thing to look at is just this whole Japanization phenomenon, even whether a country like China will need to go to zero interest rates. So we're not just talking about the developed markets, but whether this is just, a bigger trend, just given the size of the debt burden and the need to maintain social stability, which means that you will have to keep interest rates low. So when I take a look at China, for example, we've seen, probably about a 25% increase in its debt burden this year is likely. And so will it go towards zero interest rates? Then you really are talking about 80% of global government debt already has close to a zero yield. I mean, is this actually becoming the global phenomena when you look at the second largest economy and what's happening in China, and what this means for emerging markets, because China is a bigger multiplier. So I do think that some of those comparisons and the examples from Japan are extremely valid. And I think the key thing is that what Japan has been able to do is have household income growing faster than GDP. And so they've been able to maintain the social stability, but the social stability will be, a key factor as we look forward. And a lot of the things that we discussed in this, how unemployment is dealt with, how job creation is dealt with, whether you can truly do a recovery that's transformative, those are all the things that will need to be the subject of future discussion.
Yeah, and I did want to get into, as opposed to Japan, where there has been much more sort of social stability and sort of equal outcomes in the U.S. in particular, there's much more unequal impacts of this crisis and other forces, and I think that's another thing to explore. But Helga, 30 seconds, and then we should really.
No, I can keep myself short for the simple reason that I very much agree with what Joyce has just said, and we have seen this savings glut discussion, and I think even Joyce alluded to that interest rates are declining since 40 years on trend. And that is just going to stay with us for a while. Whether we call this Japanization or whatever else, that's not so much of importance. But my take would be it'll stay. One thing maybe to add to what Joyce has just said, what you have to avoid by all means is that, and Joyce alluded to social stability, that people start to save out of fear. That would, take it from a German, that would really be a bad situation to be in if now the savings glut is even larger because people are, fearful of the future, start to save a lot and not spend their money, and thereby really reinforce the economic problems that we have. And that we have to avoid at all costs, and which is why, again, it is so important not to withdraw the fiscal stimulus too early, to instill confidence into our companies and into our workers that this will eventually be over and that we are in this for good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olga. Oishi-san, any final words, or we're past time, but if you have 10 seconds, no? Okay.
No, actually, but I think, I don't know if it's Japanizing or not, but I think I'm relatively optimistic, and I think, for example, like as I mentioned, the digitalization or new transformation or transition to the new type of economy. I think that the economy in innovation in that industry or in that area, I think could produce more economic growth or employment. So in that sense, I'm. Agreed. After some certain point, I'm relatively optimistic.
That's a great word to end on, optimistic. So let's stop there before we have any more bad thoughts. This is terrific, really terrific conversation. I wish we had another hour. We've really taken advantage of your great expertise and your time, and appreciate it. Thank you, Oishi-san. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Joyce. We'll have you back. And thank you to the audience for your patience and for listening. We will post this as a video on our website in the next day or two, and you can watch it again. So thank you so much. Have a good day.